According to data from Statista.com, the average price of a new home sold in 2020 in the USA was $391,000. According to Climate Change Realty, the price of finding your real estate agent and creating thousands of dollars in donations to support climate action is and always will be $0. Welcome to the podcast. Gaël, great to meet you, man. Thanks so much for taking some time to come on the show. We're going to have a really interesting episode today. Very confident about that.
Thanks, man. No, I really appreciate you bringing me on. And I just love chatting about these topics. So super welcome.
Yeah. And you have a vast knowledge base on a lot of interesting stuff, and you're doing a bunch of amazing things. So before we dive into it, I always love to get the podcast started with a bit of background on who you are and how you got to be doing what you're doing at the current moment.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm a chemist by background. I've always loved chemistry. You know, making bombs in my garage when I was 12 years old. You know, I've always liked that kind of side of things. And my dad was an environmentalist as well. So I ended up doing chemistry at university and naturally was attracted towards renewable technologies and such things. And it was towards the end of my master's degree that I started working on CO2 utilization and electrochemistry. And they became my two kind of big passions is, you know, how can we leverage these technologies to make a better world? And, you know, since then I've been on a mission to actually bring that into being in the industry rather than just in an academic setting.
Right. And so if you can't tell by the accent, he's out in the UK. Where are you from originally? And why do you think you got interested in this stuff? You said your dad was an environmentalist. What did your mother do?
Well, yeah, so born in Wales, Cardiff, the capital city. My dad, yeah, as you said, environmentalist, building wind farms, pellet mills for biomass. But my mum was, she was a social worker, so she had a big heart and really cared about people. So I guess in a way that has kind of motivated me to think a lot about compassion and suffering and to take climate change really seriously, because ultimately it's a question of like this, you know, suffering of people and planet. So I think she instilled the heart into me as well.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So CO2 utilization and electrochemistry. We're gonna have to break those topics down for someone who's never doesn't really understand what any of that is. Before we go too deep into the science, coincidentally enough, you also participated in this deep science venture program similar to Toby, who we previously had on the podcast. So I wondered if you could share a bit about your experience there.
Yeah, well, Deep Science Ventures is a obsessed bunch of people who are relentlessly chasing after impactful solutions in energy, health, computation, agriculture. So they try and identify the world's biggest problems and then come up with innovative breakthrough solutions for that. So that's who they are. I joined towards the end of my PhD. I still had my thesis to write up, but I'd done most of the work. And then I started working for them in the space of energy, trying to come up with different solutions in that space. So I wasn't necessarily set on the kinds of things that we'll talk about later. It was really an opportunity to look really broadly, ask lots of interesting questions to experts in academia, in industry, in policy, and trying to figure out what really needs to exist to make a difference. And so they give you, you know, mentorship, guidance, resources, everything you need essentially to build your own company. And so that, yeah, it's a wonderful group of people.
Well, they're obviously attracting some really cool people as well, which I think is pretty awesome. And I think that this is just like the beginning. How long ago was that company or organization founded? Probably not too long, I'm guessing. Right?
I think this Friday is the fifth birthday party.
Oh, cool.
Their fifth anniversary of Deep Science Ventures. So they're still young, always iterating. They've changed a lot over the last 5 years, but I think they're really scaling up in a powerful way at the moment.
Totally. They're making some big moves. So shout out to them. So now let's kind of break down the two. Actually, wait, what was your thesis on when you were studying?
Oh, my thesis. Yeah. It was making catalysts. Uh, so they're materials that accelerate reactions to turn CO2 into useful chemicals like methanol, which is it has a market share of like hundreds of billions of dollars every year. So, big commodity chemicals. If anyone who might be listening to this is aware of a company like Opus 12, they do the exact type of chemistry that I was really interested in my PhD.
Methanol. You're saying it's $1 billion
Methanol.
industry, but I've never heard of it. What does it do?
Oh, it's like the big chemical that like most people in the public don't know. It's in paints. Helps make glues. It's used for chemical transformations. It's you'll find a bottle of it in every chemical lab. It's a great solvent for lots of things. It's just a very useful chemical. It's I was just going to say it's the shortest alcohol that you can get. So it's one carbon less than the alcohol that we like to get drunk off, and it's the impurity in like homebrew distillation that makes people blind. so so that's how people might come into contact with it.
Well, that's always good, isn't it? So you were studying a catalyst, which I find very interesting. And for anyone who doesn't know, a catalyst, correct me if I'm wrong, is like an input you put into a process that actually makes a reaction start happening, right?
Yeah, it either makes it happen or it just makes it happen a lot faster.
Okay.
But crucially, it doesn't become consumed itself. So it's like a tool, right? If you were trying to nail in nails into a wall, well, you could do it with enough brute force. But if you have a hammer, you're going to nail a lot more nails into that wall in a short space of time.
Gotcha. I just find the idea of a catalyst very interesting. Like, an idea can be a catalyst for someone to change their life path or something.
Yeah.
It goes more existential than just science. But okay, let's start by talking about what like the big issue in the room, the whole carbon thing. So can you kind of explain to me, because I know you know a lot about this, how we turn coal, oil, and gas into energy, just to start?
Yeah, of course. So, you know, these things obviously do not create energy. They just transform energy that hit the earth a very long time ago, and turned into plants and then became coal, oil, and gas. Um, and so we turn those into energy by simply burning them. It's the crudest way of getting energy out of anything. You set it on fire, you make loads of heat, you boil loads of water, turn that into steam, put that through a turbine, and out comes a load of electricity. That's how we've run our planet for the last 200 years. But it's kind of crude, really. Burning things. We've been burning things since we were, cavemen.
Right.
So, there are other ways that are coming online now.
So there's like all these atoms and protons, and these carbon ones are like really condensed sources of material, and when we burn them it creates more energy than if we were burning something like wood. Wood is also carbon, but the oil or the coal is like a really condensed form of it, right?
It has among like of all fuels, it has among the highest energy densities. So compared to batteries and various things, per kilo, you're going to get, or per volume, actually, you're going to get the most energy out. It's just super usable. Things like wood have a lot of types of bonds that make it a less effective fuel.
So like, when did you first become interested in this? And well, before I go there, how is, you say that burning it is like a crude way of extracting energy? Would there be a way for us to use hydrocarbons in a more efficient way to use more energy, maybe before it releases the carbon back into the atmosphere potentially?
Well, you're always going to release. Well, there's different ways of going about this, but you can convert hydrocarbons into hydrogen, for example, and then you can use technology called fuel cells that converts the hydrogen um, into energy, reacting it with oxygen to form water. That is quite an efficient process, and you can do that in such a way that you lock up the carbon as solid carbon. That's quite let's say like a less a less mature way of going about it. Um, but that's kind of one of the ways that's an interesting way you can extract the useful energy out of hydrocarbons, but keeping the carbon locked up as a solid.
How long have we known how to do something like that?
Well, a few decades really. Fuel cells, started coming around, like actually being useful in the last few decades. Still very expensive technologies though. And people have kind of extracted hydrogen out of hydrocarbons since the Second World War. Actually, uh, uh, Nazi Germany didn't have access to oil, but they had access to coal, and they could take the hydrogen out of the coal, and then they actually used that to make fuels that they needed to drive their war efforts. Um, so yeah, about 60, 70 years now.
So are you consuming that hydrogen? Is the hydrogen being released into the atmosphere as well in that case, or no?
Well, if you're converting the hydrogen via fuel cell, then it goes back to water. If you're making fuels out of the hydrogen and carbon monoxide when you break down coal, then that actually goes back to CO2. So
Okay.
that's not a good thing from a climate change perspective,
Right.
unless you get the CO2, as we may talk about later, from the air or a biological source.
Right. All right. Complex science stuff. Let's talk about something I
Yeah.
actually understand, which is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Can you tell me a bit about? And then I had read an article that the UK is like ramping this up big time. Could you kind of explain what that is for people? A lot of environmental advocates are like, shut down the coal plants, kill everything, and then there's also people who are like, hey, we actually need to have energy. Like there are energy shortages in Europe. I think that Germany was experiencing issues. Now we have a war that's going on that's constricting the oil supply. So carbon capture, utilization, and storage is a really nice kind of holdover strategy in my mind. I wonder if you could kind of explain that and talk about how the industry is going in in the UK.
Yeah, well, carbon capture and utilization is a family of technologies that that you can kind of cut it up in two ways. There's a group of technologies that can capture CO2 from concentrated emissions like power plants and cement factories and steel works and things like that. So that's just capturing it, and that's quite an old technology. That's several decades old now. And then there's capturing it from the air. So that's capturing it from a very low concentrated source. Um, and that obviously is a lot harder to do. And that's why that direct air capture is kind of the new hot thing. But it has a lot of benefits because you're not just dealing with the emissions of the present, but you're dealing with the emissions of the past. You're dealing with the historical emissions of the Industrial Revolution in effect, or the emissions since then. So that's the ways that you can either mitigate, petrochemical processes or capture carbon from the air, and then the utilization part and storage is then is a range of technologies that takes the CO2 and does something useful with it, utilizes it. So that could be to make fuels, that could be to make plastics, building materials, and a variety of chemicals as well. And there's so many different ways of doing that, and you can't quite pigeonhole that. And then there's the storage side of things, which can range just from sticking it in the ground, some kind of reservoir, a saline aquifer, um, or finding unique geological sites that contain rocks rich in materials which can actually react with that carbon dioxide and form carbonates. So Norway, they have a government-backed oil company that's been injecting CO2 under the seabed for the last 20 years and monitoring that process. And I mean, they're the ones who report the results, but they say that they can verify the safe and on that timescale permanent removal of CO2 into these locations. Um, so so there is some uncertainty in a way, because can you monitor every part of the seabed? But if you understand the geology well enough using like sort of seismic imaging, then you can at least have a very long, 100-year sort of time scale confidence that the CO2 will stay there. But it certainly depends from area to area.
All right. So the previous president, who shall not be named, that people get roused up about in this country, talked about this idea of clean coal. And I think people laugh at that. But there is an interesting thing. First off, do you by chance know what percent of UK power comes from coal-fired power plants offhand, or no?
It's quite low. We've been progressively turning it off, and and I'll see news reports every so often being like, we didn't use any coal power for an entire month, or whatever. And is about 45% renewable at the best times. So, but I think it's under 10% usually.
Okay. Well, it used to be a lot. I guess that might not be a great example. Perhaps oil or natural gas is a better example. But something I wanted
Yeah,
to talk to you about was this idea of decarbonizing oil and gas production in the UK. Is it the same? Because I'm thinking about it as like coal, and they use like scrubbers and capture the CO2. So I guess, just, do you think it's possible to decarbonize hydrocarbon, energy production?
it's definitely possible. You can take that CO2 and you can stick it into geological formations, just as I was explaining. But the thing that I don't know is like, well, it's just a transition technology. It can never really be a permanent solution. So why waste resources on a stopgap kind of solution when we could be plowing those resources into things that transcend that kind of technology and isn't based on a finite resource. Um, so yes, it's possible. Should we do it? Well, maybe there will be a range of applications that will never be um, will always emit some amount of CO2, at least for the next 100 to 200 years. Um, and so maybe that there might be just some things that are difficult to replace with a better technology, and therefore we should just clean up our waste, because you can think of carbon capture as just a waste collection service, and there may be some situations where it makes sense, but I don't want to see a world where we just plug carbon capture onto every chimney and don't think about how to avoid it in the first place. The best thing to do with waste is avoid making it in the first place.
Yeah, well, people are definitely thinking about it, but what comes to mind particularly is freight shipping. I think yes, freights are ships, and aviation is really, really difficult to decarbonize. So
Exactly.
I just want to be realistic when I'm trying to think about problem solving. There are people, it's mostly a human problem in the sense that all the solutions do exist. If we had one benevolent dictator, he could decarbonize the economy overnight, and we probably would still be able to produce everything. But there are systems in place and livelihoods and blah 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 blah. So it's always good to just kind
Yeah.
of understand everything that's going on. But I agree with you in the sense that if it's a finite resource, versus, I mean, you can't really consider the sun a finite resource. I mean, without the sun, there's no people. But it's certainly less finite than the oil and gas supply that we have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've got like we have over 1 billion years left of enjoying the sun, so we're good.
I wonder if there's something we could do to extend that a little bit more. Who knows? But cool. Well, thanks for the kind of broad introduction about what's kind of going on in that space. Let's talk about what you're up to, man. What is Mission Zero Technologies?
Yeah, well, Mission Zero Technologies is a direct air capture company. We separate CO2 from the air and then concentrate that to produce a pure form of CO2. And then we work with users of CO2 to either store that into building materials, or we're exploring other kinds of products that make use of that CO2. We're, kind of the second wave of direct air capture. Shout out to the first wave, but we think we have some, nifty innovations that will lower the cost of direct air capture and make it easier to deploy. And so we're at, still an early stage, designing our first pilot plant, and doing all the technology development to make sure it works well. And yeah, that's kind of where we are. We're still a small team, We're about eight people, but we've got a new hiring plan, and we'll be hiring quite a few people over the next year.
How does one go about lowering the cost of a direct air capture plant? And by the way, direct air capture, sucking carbon out of the air and doing something with it. That's like pretty much
Yeah,
broad.
yeah. And there's it turns out there's dozens of ways of doing that, but how do we make that cheaper? Well, one of the big costs of direct air capture is the amount of energy required to do that. You have to move a hell of a lot of air. And then when you have that CO2 captured in some form, you require about 5 times the energy you use to capture it to get it out again. So generally, the way that we capture it stabilizes it in such a way that you require even more energy to release it as a concentrated gas. That has typically been done using heat. So Carbon Engineering, Climeworks, they heat up their materials to release the CO2. And that is a very energy intensive step and makes it quite hard to deploy it wherever you want. In the case of Carbon Engineering, they use natural gas to release the CO2. Sounds kind of intuitive in some ways. And Climeworks uses steam, so they situate themselves with people near waste heat or geothermal energy. And so that kind of imposes a bit of a deployment constraint. And my vision of direct air capture was always something that you could deploy wherever there is air and electricity, not having to co-locate with some specific thing like geothermal energy. So we found an electrochemical way of doing that. And so using electricity, we can move ions around and separate the CO2 using these electrochemical cells. And I might have to go back a step to explain that a little bit.
Maybe.
So when you dissolve CO2 in our solvent, it ionizes. So and this is the same process that happens when you have a fizzy drink, like a glass of beer or Coca-Cola. When the CO2 dissolves in there, it doesn't stay as CO2. It actually stays as carbonic acid. So that's why it's tangy, because it's acidic. So the CO2 reacts with a molecule of water, and then you create H2CO3, and that in water dissociates into protons and into bicarbonate ions. So, and that's also the same way we get CO2 out of our body. In our muscles, you make CO2 that gets turned into these ions that's transported to the lungs, and then a catalyst interconverts CO2, and then you breathe it out. So we it's bio-inspired what we're doing. We make these ions, and then we pass those ions through the electrochemical cell, and then the voltage drives those ions apart and concentrates them in another chamber. So there's a lot of sort of mimicry with how our cells move CO2 around.
I think that's smart. how how'd you figure it out? Who figured it out? How did it come? Like, what goes on in these labs? Like, how do you guys like figure this stuff out? I'm so totally different way of like thinking than me.
Well, um, the funny thing is, in deep science ventures, you don't have a lab. You just do a lot of thinking,
I do
and
like that.
yeah, like we started without any experimental work. So that's how we started. And I kind of, it sounds corny, but I had an inspirational dream, where I had a dream so abstract. I had a dream of CO2 dissolving into water, just like I described earlier, forming, ions in water, and then you can get these membranes which only allow ions to cross over them. And so in this dream, I saw bicarbonate ions moving across a membrane and separating from oxygen and nitrogen, because the membranes only allow ions; they don't allow other gases. And so I had this dream. I was like, oh yeah, that's a way of getting CO2 away from nitrogen and oxygen and all the other things that's in the air. And that was the basis. It wasn't what we're doing now, but it was the seed of inspiration that led me to doing a lot more research in that area and finding ways to actually turn that into something. We have a whole graveyard of ideas. I don't know if you've heard of the whiteboarding software Miro, but it's just full of like you know drawings and diagrams and ridiculous things that we eventually swiped off one by one as until we found something that we could actually deploy quite easily and actually made sort of sense. It didn't invoke kind of bespoke materials and crazy new designs and stuff. We wanted something that we could actually build really easily and ideally procure from existing suppliers, and we achieved that.
Have you had experiences like that before, where you've had like a dream about like your thesis or something you're studying and had like a breakthrough? I've never heard a story like that before.
No,
I'm like dreaming about
no,
like
no,
my
no,
parents
never.
not telling me what to do still. Like, that's me.
Well, yeah. Well, I used to have dreams while doing my PhD of mixing things together in the lab and discovering a brand new catalyst, but they never made actual chemical sense. They always were just kind of abstract and useless. Um, so yeah, it was the first useful science dream I've ever had.
Well, that's so cool in the sense that they say sometimes you do your best work when you're not working. You know what I mean?
Mm,
So that's really interesting.
yeah,
So your company, your methodology for direct air capture is ionization, you said, right?
yeah. Like that's a central part of it.
Okay. And when you capture the carbon, is it always stored in H2O, in like water, or in just a different, or like in a liquid form, or does it need water, or can it just be, how is
Yeah.
it being stored?
Yeah, so the first step is CO2, well, the air being mixed with our water-based capture solvent.
Okay.
So it's water plus a molecule which stabilizes CO2 as ions, and then that solution gets passed through our separation cell, which takes those ions and then concentrates them, and then releases it as pure CO2 gas.
So you are capturing gas then.
We're capturing gas, temporarily handling it in solution, and then converting it back into a pure gas.
And then what are you going to do with the gas?
Yeah, so there's loads of things you can do, but our first application is making building materials. So there's a company in the UK called OCO Technologies, and they've got a great process where they take ash from incineration processes and they react that with carbon dioxide and other materials, and they form building aggregates that can be used for all types of construction purposes. So they have a site in England, and we'll be building our pilot plant at their site, producing CO2 and sending that into their process. And that's great because we're doing carbon removal and we're selling a product. So
Yeah. Well, one thing that's interesting to me is that the most successful business ever in my mind is Apple. And they are
Mm.
just real they sell products. And then you have like Amazon and Walmart who are like really successful businesses, and they sell products, but they do make things now, but they didn't start off by making anything. So it's just very curious about which industries have like the most impact. When you talk to me, I think of a world where at this point we should be, if there's going to be something that's a carbon-based product like concrete or whatever, we should be pulling it all out of the atmosphere now. What are your kind of plans for the long-term viability of this model? Is it just to sell more and more? It's just to turn what you capture into something that people can use. So you're not going for like the permanently store in the ground? And then how are they making money if they're just storing it in the ground, you know?
We're going to do everything. We're going to be
Do it
one
all.
of the biggest suppliers of green CO2 in the world. So yes, we're doing the utilization stuff, but we're actually exploring projects where we're injecting it into the ground, a bit like that Iceland example I gave earlier. They all of that needs to happen,
Right.
if we're going to address this challenge. But how does the storing it in the ground business model work?
Right.
Well, you have companies like Shopify, Stripe, Microsoft, and others who are looking to um, fulfill their net zero commitments. And that means that they have to remove the amount of CO2 that their operations produce. And there's lots of ways you can do that. There's reforestation programs and all kinds of things. But the most verifiable, most permanent way of doing that is direct air capture. And because of those qualities, these companies are willing to pay a lot more to remove that CO2. So whereas reforestation could cost you $10 per ton or less, direct air capture is going to be costing, well, at the moment, hundreds of dollars per ton. The game is to get it under $100 per ton. But even so, these companies are catalyzing the industry by sort of paying quite high rates to get it going. And if you look at all the carbon commitments, the net zero commitments of the big multinational corporations, if you add up that amount of CO2, it's massive. So they are voluntarily paying extra to clean up their trash, basically. They're taking a step that they don't actually need to take, but I guess
Depends how you look at it.
Yeah, you could say like they need a license to operate. They need the public to agree, that they're doing the right thing. So there's there's a PR aspect to it, but I think there is also a responsibility that people are increasingly feeling.
Well, also, to be fair, if Microsoft wants to keep selling computers and Apple wants to keep selling computers, they need people who can afford to buy computers. And if the entire ecological system is collapsing because we've been emitting tons and tons of carbon for 7 decades, then
Yes.
their business models might not work forever. If you might think. So yeah, short answer: carbon credits. Fair enough. Um, I'm always trying to think about ways to monetize things in a more clever way. You should definitely connect with Tommy from B Zero. They're doing a lot of cool stuff with
Oh
the
yeah,
voluntary carbon.
yeah.
Oh, do you know him already?
I don't personally know him, but my co-founder Shill has been chatting to B Zero. I'm not sure if it's Tom, but yeah, like conversations are currently ongoing.
Well, he's the CEO. So, do you guys need to use like fans at all, or does the CO2 naturally come in through
Oh.
your liquid?
Yeah, currently we're using fans. It's the fastest way to get CO2 in. There are ways of relying on the wind and other things, and that's cool, and we probably will look at that one day, but at the moment we're not relying on the wind. It's a little bit it's a little bit less reliable,
Right.
shall we say.
Um, And do you ever engage in dialogue with like really pure like naturalists who are more into like reforestation and stuff like that? And then kind of how does that compare to like what you're doing? Like someone might, like the mad scientist approach, perhaps. I talk to like people from all over the spectrum, and I love that people are just trying. You know what I mean? I don't think there's a right or wrong way of going about doing things. I think you just got to try and see what works. I just wonder if I could gauge your thoughts on that before we start talking about your other venture.
I don't have, if I'm honest, I'm really saturated in what I'm doing. And now before I zoomed out, and now I've zoomed in. And so I wouldn't say I've been having any conversations with naturalists. We have spoken to, we did chat to a reforestation company about a year ago that have been doing some kind of quite cool work with specializing on the types of trees that you use. And, I had some conversations about kelp and that kind of stuff, but I am a little bit zoomed out from that. So I don't feel like I speak from any kind of position of expertise.
Well, I mean, what I would say to that is I like that. I think that makes a lot of sense. If you really want, like you said, you want to become like one of the biggest players in this space, the way you do that is by focusing in and not worrying about what someone else is thinking. Whereas me, I'm just trying to talk to everyone because it's just really fun. So let's kind of transition here and talk about this idea of green hydrogen, because you're not only working on Mission Zero Tech, you have another company, Supercritical Solutions. So what is green hydrogen?
Green hydrogen is hydrogen made from water. Usually, there are probably some ways of making it from plants and stuff, but really the space is dominated by companies that are developing technologies called electrolyzers, and they use a voltage, a couple electrodes, and a ionically conductive solution to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. This is a technology that has existed for maybe 200 years now, like at least from a first demonstrated perspective. But it's only been ramping up in the last couple of decades as there's been an increasing kind of case for it, because it's not as cheap as fossil fuels, and so you have to have climate change to spur people on to think about it. It's been dominated by basically three types of technologies for the last couple of decades. And no one's really been asking other ways of redesigning it to make it better. People have just been looking at small iterations. Oh, can we make it cheaper? Can we make the catalyst a little bit better? Quite kind of small things, I think. And so I looked at these technologies and I said, well, how much better can they really get? Okay, maybe they get 10% better, 20% better. Maybe China just produces them really cheaply. But let's try and reinvent it a little bit. And so that's how Supercritical Solutions was formed. I looked at the costs of electrolyzers and I said, well, membranes are super expensive. The membranes that are used in the electrolyzers. Is there a way to make an electrolyzer without a membrane? You need the membrane normally to separate your hydrogen from the oxygen. If they mix, you have an explosive mixture, and that's not a good thing. Self-evidently, and the other issue is that these electrolyzers don't normally produce very high pressure hydrogen, and the biggest use case for hydrogen in the world, it's like 90% of all hydrogen, is used to make fertilizers. It's like $100 billion market, and so we've developed an electrolyzer that has avoided the membrane, and so that's a cost saving and tends to be the first component to fail. We can produce high pressure hydrogen, which represents a massive cost for the normal consumer that typically buys it, and we run it a kind of a relatively hot condition that makes it much higher productivity of hydrogen at a lower energy. So we're kind of hitting a bunch of things by redesigning the electrolyzer, and we think that will make the kind of the best product for delivering hydrogen to one of the biggest applications that's currently in the market.
So the biggest application is these fertilizers, which whether people realize or not, we're using a lot of that to eat food. What other
Yeah.
use cases is there for like hydrogen or hydrogen power that we are it's something that's in our daily lives right now?
In our daily lives, we don't really see much of hydrogen other than fertilizers. You might hear about hydrogen fuel cell cars. They kind of haven't really been able to make much traction, mostly in Japan, if anywhere. You can that people are talking about hydrogen for decarbonizing steel production. Um, so when you're iron production, sorry, when you're taking the ore and trying to make your iron, people usually use carbon to reduce the ore to its metal, and that makes a lot of CO2. But you can use hydrogen to do that instead. So then you can uh, vastly reduce the sort of amount of emissions required that are imposed when you produce iron. It's something like 1.5 tons of CO2 is produced for every ton of iron that you make. It's massive.
1.2?
1.5, I think. You'll have to check me on that, actually. It's been a while since I've been
No worries.
using these
More.
numbers.
Yeah. Well, it's crazy. I mean, I'm impressed by how much you know already. It's really insane. So the idea of green hydrogen being using hydrogen in place of carbon, which will continue that greening effect, whereas hydrogen will have less of a greening effect, or will it have none? Sorry, less of a warming effect. Warming effect. I mean,
Zero warming effect. Yeah. I mean, it makes water vapor, and water vapor, it actually does have a warming effect. So it kind of depends on what you do with the water afterwards. But usually it's pretty simple to collect the water. So we shouldn't be too worried about the water that's produced when you burn hydrogen.
yeah. I mean, what kind of water is this? Is just like regular water?
Yeah. Yeah. Regular water.
I mean, that seems pretty good to me.
It is pretty good. You're not going to get any better than that.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, water is like the source of all life. And then carbon, we're made out of carbon, but it seems to be the more we put it out, the more things are dying, is the thesis that we're kind of dealing with right now. What does like a distillery have to do with this electrolysis of hydrogen process?
Yeah. So the distillery is Supercritical's first pilot plant opportunity. So we won that from the British government because they put out a competition for how to decarbonize distilleries. Why is the UK government interested in that? Well, in Scotland, they produce a lot of whiskey, like so much whiskey that the Scots could never hope to even drink the amount of whiskey that they produce.
Got to give him a chance, man. Come on.
So it's like it is a really highly emitting industry because
Okay.
I don't know the process so well, but it involves a few processes. One is like boiling the some of the ingredients for very long periods of time to extract sugars and various things from it, and then there's another stage where you distill the water out of the sort of pre-whiskey product to bring it up to strength. And so that's usually been, that's those usually require burners of some kind. And so our project will be testing. Well, first it will be demonstrating our electrolyzer at a reasonable scale, and it will be testing hydrogen firing to do these heating processes without using natural gas or in some cases they use sort of diesel and things like that. So it's simply replacing a flame for another type of flame, and a petrochemical flame with a hydrogen flame.
Hey everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Gaël. He's obviously the man, but unfortunately, we ran out of storage space on his computer at the end, so the last three questions are basically unrecoverable. So I talked to him about what it was like working on two startups at the same time, and he's pretty optimistic, positive about it, which is cool. He's obviously enjoying what he's doing, but I don't want to put any words in his mouth. So unfortunately, we're gonna have to cut it here. I asked him what it's like working at two startups at the same time, if he saw any limit to human capacity to create better technology, and then of course I always ask what advice he has for young people who are passionate about building a better world. But it's all good because we're going to have to follow up with him in the future because he's just getting started on his journey. And that's what I had said in the podcast as well. So I just want to give a big shout out to Gaël. He's the man. It was really great having him on the show. But unfortunately, the clips are they're like mangled, pixelated stuff with audio looping every 2 seconds. So they're just basically unrecoverable. But yeah, thank you, man. It was awesome having you. I love everything you're doing. Looking forward to following your journey as it continues to go on. And I really, really appreciate the time, man. Thanks so much. So if you or anyone else you know is looking to buy or sell a home anywhere in the USA and would like to create thousands of dollars in donations without any cost out of pocket, please visit ccrealty.org today.